Here's what we do. First of all, if you haven't figured this out by now, this is not formal. Okay? What we do is every month we have here at Hattie's Cafe a topic that we think is of interest that deals with technology in the small medium business market. And we don't necessarily, you're not really going to see, I absolutely stole some stuff from Microsoft's PowerPoints here. Okay? I'm not going to lie to you on that one. But it's not going to be a, if you do this, your business will be wonderfully, whatever. We'll talk about the good, we'll talk about the bad, because the whole idea is let's talk about impact on business, both in terms of cost and benefit. And let's talk about some of the, lift the hood a little bit and try not to get too geeky on it. And also, since we're feeding you for free, we're not really, doing a big advertisement, so we didn't put a whole lot of time into the finesse part of this. Instead, we'd rather just talk about the product, okay? So, absolutely make this a two-way street, because otherwise you're stuck with what I put together, and trust me, that just is not going to go well for either of us, okay? So, yeah, I get real big into those parts. All right, how many of you, let's get a little bit of hand show. How many of you are currently working with SharePoint either from a technical or from an end-user standpoint? Okay, cool. See some hands. And how many of you are working primarily as a technician versus an end user? And by end user, it'd be site manager, that kind of thing. How many on the technical side? Okay, got one in the back. And how many more on the end user management kind of thing? All right, cool. And how many of you are, is anyone working with the Foundation, the new version? Actually, I'm trying to figure out who exactly I can snow and how. So, everybody who didn't raise your hand, I really can say pretty much whatever, and you guys have to be worried about on the end user, and I'm going to have to bribe you at the end of the meeting, so just, okay. Here's the thing, SharePoint's been around since about 2001, and one of the things that I get into, people get into this whole thing about what is SharePoint, what does it do, all that kind of fun stuff. The problem is that from the beginning, SharePoint has been horribly marketed. And I don't mean in a traditional sales standpoint, but in terms of its positioning to the end user and to the customer community. And one of the problems is because it wasn't until people started using it, and really organizations started using it, that it kind of made sense. And a parallel, and for those of us who are old geeks, would be Microsoft Exchange. When Exchange was first introduced, it was really supposed to be a Lotus Notes killer. Oh, by the way, it would also do email. Okay? And then as it grew, it was supposed to be kind of a framework for development. And then they said, oh, never mind, it just does email. Okay, and now Exchange is an email server. Okay. With SharePoint, the whole idea was to put together a team collaboration. All right? For people who are working on multiple sites and all that, or multiple documents and all that we could work together. Why? Because Office wasn't selling. Part of the challenge from Microsoft's standpoint was they were coming out with new versions of Office on a regular basis, and people weren't buying the newer versions. So what they did in around 2003 was they started coming up with these collaboration tools built into Office. Where send me the document by email, I'll put notes in it and comments, and then I'll send it back to you. You'll put notes in, and nobody used it. Okay? So what Microsoft did was they said, well, tell you what we're going to do is we're going to pull the collaboration part outside of Office into this whole thing called SharePoint, but then we'll have people work with it in collaboration with Office and SharePoint and all that. That's kind of where they went. The key word that I use when I talk about SharePoint is community. When you create a SharePoint site, you are effectively creating a community. Now, you've got successful communities and you've got unsuccessful communities. And what I mean by that is, do people stick around? Okay? So if you figure out, if we're going to build a community, we want people to live there and to go around, we need some things for them to actually take advantage of that have to do with their day-to-day life. The same thing is true with SharePoint. And we'll kind of, you'll get the idea for that. Yeah, let me see. One of the things that Microsoft really loves to do with SharePoint is change the freaking name. Okay? So, and we were actually talking about Elizabeth Taylor And how many times, because, you know, it's a big topic among geeks. But we were talking about how many times Elizabeth Taylor got married, and then we didn't get to this part, but every time she would change her name, or she actually didn't, but it would be with this last name, this last name. Well, SharePoint is the Elizabeth Taylor of the IT community, because they've always kept it as SharePoint something. The SharePoint Team Services and SharePoint Portal Server, and we'll get into the difference in a minute. And then they renamed it to SharePoint Services 2.0. No, they didn't. They named it SharePoint Services 2003. Later they said, well, we meant 2.0. Oh, thanks, guys. SharePoint Portal Server 2003. And then in 2007, they called it, okay, WSS 3.0, which is Windows SharePoint Services. So you went from Team Services to SharePoint Services 2003 to WSS 3.0. We renamed this back to SharePoint Services 2.0, and now, of course, for 2010, let's call it Foundation Server. So we have SharePoint Foundation Server 2010 and SharePoint Server 2010. Essentially, and by the way, I'm going to lie on a few of these things just to keep it relatively simple. Microsoft has always had two versions of SharePoint that has been active. There's a free version, which is usually the word services is there. That's the key thing. When I say free, it's included with the Windows license. So if you have a Windows server there, you can download and add the Windows SharePoint services without additional cost. And whoever is licensed to connect to that server is licensed to connect to the services and the sites that you create. Relatively straightforward. Then we have the SharePoint Server, whether it be Microsoft Office SharePoint Server, SharePoint Portal Server, SharePoint Portal Server 2000, whatever. The keyword is servers in there. There you have two costs. First of all, you have the software to actually purchase a license for that server, and then everyone who's going to connect to it and use it needs to pay what's called a CAL, or a Client Access License. Okay? My recommendation to you folks, well, first of all, let me back up a second. So what's the difference between services and server? And we're really going to focus on the services here, okay? Again, getting back to that metaphor that I was using, a community is for SharePoint services. A metropolitan city is for the server. So you've got all of these communities that are linked together with federated services. Federated services, yes, we're starting to say federated a lot because you guys have caught up on all the other buzzwords. Federated is essentially, it's throughout the organization, or actually links multiple organizations together in some cases. Those multiple organizations can be within your organization or it can be without. So for example, we could create a federation, and by the way, this is not linked to SharePoint specifically. There's other tools and places as well. There are some tools where you can create a federation of, here are the organizations who are all working on this project. That is a federation of those organizations, and they can connect with their communication. So if you hear that term, that's kind of where we're going with that. Okay? So, how many of you have played with SharePoint at all? Okay, cool. Pretty much the same hands. All right. So what happens is first of all, what is it? What it is, it's a web application. That's all it is. Okay? So you have all of the components needed in order to run a web-based application. And without getting too much into it, you know, you have an IIS server that's actually pushing it out. It's an ASP.NET application, so you got all the framework stuff. And then you've got a SQL database that stores all of the data. Okay? So, what features you have, we have sites, we have communities, content searching, whatever. You can tell it's got kind of like that fuzzy glow thing, so it must be meaningful. So what happens is that we're going to have these sites, and that site is what I call the community. All right? So that site is that collection. Now, what do we want to do? And we'll talk about this when we start actually looking at the product in a second. But then we have content. So the whole idea is for us to be able to have content that's up there at the site, whether it be in the form of documents, in the form of web links, in the form of whatever, that people can see and modify and manipulate and all that good stuff. We want them to be able to search insights. One of the big changes or the additions that's going on in 2010 is there's a lot more BI that you can use, business intelligence. So you can, it's a lot easier to put KPIs because now we can use initials, so our rates just went up. Key performance indicators, we can actually have those on the site and so on and so forth. Okay, so enough of this stuff. Let's actually take a look at it. And this is, relatively speaking, a default site that when I created, we just took a server over at the office and put SharePoint Foundation services on that site. And that's what we get. So, what this has are essentially what are called web parts and document containers. So this is what an end user would see when they log on to it. So what happens is we have an announcement telling them, hey, welcome to the site, however we want to do this. We can also put up a web part that simply says, what are the latest announcements? So we can put in, here are announcements, and here's the dates they expire, so that it'll show whatever the latest announcements are, and then once the day is over for that, it'll go bye-bye. Okay, community. One of the biggest or most important things for a community is to tell its members what's going on, what's new. We can put it right here if we want to, or we can bury it somewhere down here if it's not that critical. Okay? We can also create calendars. Calendars, here are events that are upcoming or in the past. Everybody using Outlook, one level or another? So we have our calendar. Well, now we can create additional calendars that are up there. Okay? And we can do the same thing that we can do with Outlook calendars, but it's for the community. Well, that's kind of new. So here's the news. Here's what's going on right now from the announcement standpoint. Here's the calendar of events. Here's what's going to be happening or what has already happened. Pretty straightforward. Okay.
Can you link the two calendars?
Can you link the two calendars? Sort of. Okay. Has anyone done any linking between Outlook? Cool. What you can do, is you can actually connect your Outlook, and I'll just use contacts because we've got that. So here is a SharePoint contact folder, but it shows up in my Outlook. Okay? Or it's up on the cloud. It's the exact same thing. So depending upon how the end user, the person going to the site, wants to consume that information, we let them decide. Now, what it doesn't do, there's some ways around this, but I'm going to be relatively simple, is it will not take my contacts of my folder and push them up. I mean, actually, I can drag and drop them and they'll go fine. So what I can do is I can get rid of my contact folder and just use this. And the synchronizing is automatic.